few weeks ago, we booked a call with an a16z investment partner. Not someone from finance, not someone from operations or HR, but a real check writer with access to hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, I used to be at an a16z NYC-backed company, but we didn't use network or referrals to get this call. We used purely cold email. Now, many people think cold email is impossible to reach top-tier investors, but we've proven that we can break through, and we'll show you exactly how we make it work. All right, so now the first question people always ask when we say we send cold emails to VCs is, does it work? And a lot of skepticism that you can actually get top-tier VCs to respond to you without a network. So having a network helps, referrals obviously help, but if you think about the logic behind why cold emails can work for investing, it simply comes down to sending a strong enough message to an investor where they have a reasonable expectation that their time will be well spent and they could possibly be missing out on a next great big deal. So if you think about a very extreme example, imagine Mark Zuckerberg cold emails a bunch of investors. It doesn't even matter what he puts in his email. If they know it's the real Mark Zuckerberg emailing them, everyone will respond. Now, you're not going to be Mark Zuckerberg, neither am I, but there are ways that we can send the right cold email to make investors compelled enough to take the time out of their day to actually meet with you. And before we get into the actual script that we use and the general approach, one thing that's really important to highlight is the amount of traction that you need. So naturally, the more traction you have in your business, the easier it's going to be to get a response. Almost every single one of our clients is doing at least a minimum of a couple $100,000 in ARR before we run this type of outreach process. You can do it before, you can do it as a pre-revenue company, but the reality is there's so many pre-revenue companies with zero traction doing cold outreach. And if you actually have some traction, you're already catapulting yourself to the top 10% of the cold emails that they receive. And with the ability to bootstrap and generate revenue without much funding, I think a lot of investors are frankly expecting traction before you even raise your first round. And this is sort of the reality now with AI. So I really wouldn't recommend starting this cold email process unless you have some revenue and some traction. If you don't, you will need to play that game a bit more of referrals, network, and connections. All right, so I actually made a LinkedIn post about how we were able to land this particular investor call. And there's really one thing I want to call out. When it comes to investor outreach, there is a best practice to do it. If you Google how to send investor outreach, you'll see many blog articles about it. And most of the time, people recommend sending what I call a mini investor memo, which is metrics plus credibility, key metrics, proof of demand or product market fit, clear value proposition, and additional credibility signals. For most VCs, a well-structured email looks something like this. We can even Google blog posts, these are not ones I made, where basically you can see everyone is following the same format, which is a really short intro and then, bullet points into the metrics. Now, what we found is that this approach generally does work. But the thing about best practices is the more that someone does a best practice, the more that people do it, the more best practices don't work. So for our client, we send a lot of different emails, different campaigns, different angles. And when we sent the mini investor memo format, we were able to get some results. It definitely wasn't bad. What we realized is if the market's all doing one thing, sometimes you actually deliberately want to break those rules and go a different direction and you'll get more results. So we went from sending a mini investor memo format to actually what we call a more casual note. It sounds more human. It puts heavier emphasis on storytelling on your product or company with just one or two metrics. And with fewer metrics, sometimes what ends up happening is you end up creating intrigue, right? So if your metrics are the best in class, top 1% in your industry, list all your metrics. But if your metrics are just okay, then just pick the one or two that are really, really strong and build intrigue through your cold email. And that's exactly what we did. The thing that's really counterintuitive about cold email, even to investors, is that the mini investor memo format, which everyone always recommends, is easy to skim and consider best practice, but it can feel really generic. And when something underperforms, sometimes what you want to do is the exact opposite of what the market is doing. This is what we do for clients every day. We find the right people, write emails that actually cut through the noise, and book meetings that matter to your business. If you want us to do this for your company, the link is in the description. So let me go through the exact cold email script here. So rather than having a really short, clean email focused on metrics, you can actually see the email that we sent is a lot more unstructured. We introduce our founder, his background, he was at NYU and MIT, and then he's building an infrastructure suite for remote teams. You can see we go into sort of the story of why this is important, and we say how it's 10x more efficient than anything else on the market. It's really silly, but founders and VCs love this idea of 10x better, and we include that in here. So most of our email is, besides a super quick founder intro, a lot of it just goes into explaining the product. Typically, this is considered bad practice. You want to have like a one-line, explanation. You don't want to have like 4 or 5 lines of the story. But we deliberately decided to do this again to sound different from everyone else. From there, we go into some key metrics, so we're profitable, and then we include the ARR number. It's below 1 million, but it's in the 6-figure range. And we have product market fit on our core product, and then we list some of the user numbers. I wanted to build a relationship with you and your team. Once our AI Manager Copilot is fully released and distributed to all existing users, we're anticipating needing additional support to scale growth faster. Now, this is a really key line here because many investors are used to founders reaching out to them immediately at the point when they need money. But that's not how fundraising works. Realistically, oftentimes you want to try and build a relationship before you need it. So the hint that we're making here is that, hey, we don't actually need your money, but we will likely need it once we start scaling. And we find this framing to be extremely, extremely powerful. And then would it make sense to connect? And then after some back and forth, we are able to book the call for our founder. All right, besides writing an interesting cold email, how do you actually find the contacts of these investment people, these VCs? And the same way that we find contacts for lead generation efforts is the same way we find the contact for investors. And that's using a tool like AI Arc or Apollo or any lead generation tool will work to see what contact information we can find. So for instance, if we want to find people from a16z, we go to our tool, we go to company search, we can click a16z, click into the company, and then, there are going to be other lead tools that exist. They all operate pretty much the same way. Then you click employees, and then you'll be able to see all the different employees that this tool is able to find. Now I can see there are 664 records. Don't email every single a16z partner because there are many partners who don't work in investing and they're completely irrelevant to your cold email outreach. So for example, don't email a talent network partner or executive talent, right? You want to focus on investment partners. If they just have a blank title called partner, you may need to do some research to see if they actually invest, but really focus all your effort on investment partners and focus on finding the investment partner who is relevant to what you're working on. If you email a crypto investment partner about your green technology, right, it's obviously not going to be work. It's not going to make sense. You're not going to get a good response. So you will need to do a little bit of work and find exactly who it is you want to reach out to. Now, this work they need to do to find exactly the right people to reach out to is oftentimes why companies come to us for help with outbound, because the effort of nailing exactly the right person is oftentimes even harder than coming up with a great email script. Now look, the point of this video isn't to brag about how we're able to contact an a16z check writer who's control of hundreds of millions of dollars. Instead, the main point of this video is to show you that people who you think are unreachable can actually be contacted through cold email, and real deals and meetings can be done. You just need the right email, the right targeting, and the right timing. If you want to see how we might approach this for your business, either from a fundraising effort or from a lead generation perspective, the link is in the description and I'll tell you what's actually realistic. Not everyone can land a meeting with a16z, but many people can with the right effort. See you in the next one.